Latest news out of Washington, D.C. Let's go ahead and welcome HNN's White House correspondent, John Decker. Aloha, John. Thanks for joining us here. Let's jump right into this. First question for you. Donald Trump is offering a new defense for an audio clip in which he referred to those highly confidential material and secret information that he could no longer declassify. What's the former president saying, and is this helpful to the federal criminal case?
The new excuse that the former president is giving as it relates to those audio tapes that we hear in which he's in Bedminster, apparently, according to the audio tapes and according to the government, showing highly classified information, is that everything you hear, according to the former president, is, in his words, bravado. He wasn't being truthful. He was just essentially joking around with those who were in the room at office space at Bedminster, his country club there in New Jersey. Is this helpful? No, it's not helpful in the sense that he's offered up various excuses over the course of the past few weeks since that 37-count indictment was unveiled by the special counsel. And any lawyer will tell their client, do not talk about this case prior to the case being started. Whether the former president is getting that advice from his lawyers or not, he's not listening to it. And anything that he says in interviews, on the campaign trail, can be used by prosecutors against him as they prosecute this criminal case against him. That case right now scheduled to start in mid-August, but that will likely be delayed. But this is not helpful to the former president as it relates to his defense.
Got it. Now, in other legal news, confirmation from Rudy Giuliani's lawyers that the former New York City mayor met with federal investigators yesterday looking into efforts to overturn the 2020 election. What information came from that? What information could he provide to special counsel Jack Smith?
You may recall, Dylan, that in the aftermath of the 2020 election, it was Rudy Giuliani who served as the personal lawyer to former President Donald Trump. He was on every phone call with the former president. He spoke to various state officials on behalf of the former president and also reached out to various state GOP leaders, all trying to push forward a situation in which a different slate of electors would be voting on the presidential race. What the prosecutors want to talk about are specifically his efforts, the state of mind of former President Trump, and exactly what was going on from the days between November 2020 until the days that the former president left office on January the 20th of 2021. So that essentially is what the special counsel and the grand jury that's being convened by the special counsel want to hear from Rudy Giuliani about. All of that information likely disclosed by the former mayor to that special grand jury that's been comprised of 20 individuals right here in Washington, D.C.
Let's go ahead and look at the Supreme Court. Of course, John, you are a lawyer. What are some of the cases, the remaining decisions that we are expecting from the Supreme Court? And is there any sense as to how the court could rule in those cases?
There are two big cases that could impact a significant number of Americans. One has to do with affirmative action in higher education, specifically the admissions programs at both the University of North Carolina, a state university, and Harvard University, a private university. They both factor in race in determining who gets admitted to those respective universities. That I sat in the Supreme Court for oral arguments concerning that particular case. It's a different makeup of the Supreme Court. It's a 6-3 conservative majority, and it strikes me, in listening to the questions posed by those 9 justices, they are ready to revisit the use of race in college admissions. So that's one case. The other one has to do with the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness plan, the plan in which for 10 to 20 million student loan borrowers at the federal level, they could have their student loan wiped away. If you get past the standing issue, whether the plaintiffs could bring that case in the first place, I sat in oral arguments there, and justices, at least the majority of which, by my count, seem to be of the mindset that move by the Biden administration, its education department, is unconstitutional, and that would mean for those student loan borrowers at the federal level, they would have to start repaying their loans starting in October.
H&N's White House correspondent, John Decker. Thank you so much, John. Always good to talk to you.